centaurs, we've had hippos, and now we've had a goat. So we also heard this morning from the World Economic Forum about ethics, a new code of ethics in technology. And expanding on that idea a bit now, we're talking about tech for good. And we've got a panel with some great speakers from across the industry that's going to be led by David Savage, who's a founder of Tech Talks. And they
how we share the value of other kinds of assets. It means that really when we think about how we get the best value out of data, it's about not missing opportunities for it to be used to help people of all kinds make decisions which make a positive impact in the world. So that's why we focus on sharing of data, on making sure that data is more accessible to more people. So, for example, wouldn't it be great if autonomous car manufacturers shared data about where they crash so that we can improve the algorithms overall about detecting places where they might get confused, right? Wouldn't it be, we already look at things like open banking, where sharing of data enables new innovation to happen and to address some difficult issues like mental health problems, for example. But in these places, then we're talking about data that is collected by the private sector that can be used for all these public good purposes. And finding the mechanism for getting that sharing working well in a well-governed way is really what we think are the big challenges. Recently, we've been doing some work around data trusts as a kind of institution to help that data sharing happen in a more well-governed way. And the role of data trusts and the way in which you might get regulation around sharing of data are some of the areas that we're looking at to make that balance.
You mentioned about open banking, and obviously it's been wonderfully successful. But there's equally, if you look at health tech, we were talking to Babylon earlier in the series. Obviously, there's been some criticism about the way that data's been handled there. We had a company called Birdie on the show, and Max, their CEO, was talking about the fact that he felt that there needed to be something similar in health tech to an open banking model. Is that something that you see much appetite for amongst the organisations that you're working with?
So when we think about access to data, we think about it in three kinds of buckets. There's open data that anyone can access, use, and share. There's data for kind of research and innovation purposes, so like bulk data access that you can use to train machine learning models or whatever with. And then there's this very important bit, which is what open banking kind of opens up, which is access to data by individuals or actually by organizations that are affected by that data or that data is about. Because often the products and services that we want to use need to combine all three of those kinds of things. We need something that's personalized to us, and where that data is being held by a third-party organization, we need to have some way of getting hold of it to access that kind of product and service. So yeah, I think that tackling that open APIs, using our data portability rights well, getting good standardization around access to data that is about us as individuals or us as organizations, is one of the areas where we're not doing enough yet. But I see in the next 5 years, that's going to be a place where there's real innovation happening.
I don't want to focus on Jeni too much. Obviously,
No,
this is with Open Data Institute kind of an area of expertise, but Paul, you're talking to a number of different startups and scale-ups, obviously, and Tessa, you're running a scale-up. Would that be fair to say at this point? OLIO's doing very well. Is this something that you were thinking about at an early stage? Obviously, you're collecting data on a number of different users about how you could share that data with other organizations for the greater good that also helps your mission and purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way we think about it is that it's about what do you want to do with tech and data. So we're really looking for intentionality. So we're looking for founders, investors, people who want to use their skills intentionally to solve big social and environmental problems. I don't think any of us can accept that like tech is neutral anymore. If it's neutral, then it's probably bad, or it can be used for bad. And actually, the growth, I think, is in founders and people who want to go after a particular mission with tech. And for us, we love them if they're going after the really big missions, whether that's about, solving big health problems, tackling climate change, addressing the failings in our democracy. And that's what I think is really interesting in this question of can tech serve the world? Yes, but only if we're deliberate about it.
Tessa, any thoughts on this? Or?
Yeah, so we've certainly noticed in our community, I guess, a real backlash about the experience that they've had with the players such as Facebook and stuff like that. And that's really reflecting the expectation that they have on us as a business in terms of how we treat their data, which is extremely carefully. And obviously, we're connecting people who don't know each other in real life. And so there's a location issue there. And so our main objective actually is to empower the users to be in control of what data they disclose to who, when. Linked to the kind of sharing of data thing, though, because what we're doing hasn't been done by anyone else before, anywhere in the world, we've actually had a lot of universities reach out to us who are really keen to access our data set to understand what that sharing looks like in a particular geography, and then sort of mapping that onto sociodemographics and stuff like that. And so we have been working with a small number of universities to bring out some really interesting insights.
Look, I don't want to spend the entire session talking about data, and I'm aware that time is ticking on, but are there any questions before we move on, specifically about data and its use I'd imagine there must be one or two, but I can't actually see a huge amount of the glare of the lights, to be perfectly honest. Okay, we'll move on. I didn't see any hands. Andrew, we'll bring you into the conversation. Work for a large organisation. Vodafone Foundation obviously work in partnership with a lot of startups. But you go to places that your broader big tech commercial team necessarily wouldn't go. Do you think there's some kind of responsibility on what Vodafone Foundation do to help educate the wider narrative within Vodafone as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, picking up on the data piece, so about 4 years ago, the Wellcome Trust approached us via the head of investor relations to work with an NGO, they may be in the room, called Flowminder, which is a big data NGO based here in the UK, to look at, particularly look at Ghana. So there was anxiety about if there was to be another outbreak of Ebola, and if it was to spread to Ghana, what would be the best way of preventing the spread of Ebola, but it could also be for dengue fever, cholera, malaria, and so on. So it took us 2 years because of all the issues around conversations with the Ghana Statistical Service and others, but after 2.5 years of conversations, of agreeing a framework, we're now processing data sets, anonymized, aggregated data sets, to look at people movements so that should there be an advent, and sadly there is at the moment in the DRC, but should there be an advent of that infectious disease, then the Ministry of Health in Ghana would be able to proactively understand much more effectively where to prevent the spread of that disease. So, I think the question is tech going to save the world, or is data going to save the world? Not necessarily, but it is going to save lives, and it does save lives. And that's just sort of one example. But there are many other examples. I mean, I think if you take a traditional approach to philanthropy, then you're just going to invest in whatever organization you wish to do so. You take the approach we've done, where we say we're not really in the business of writing checks. What we're in the business of doing is bringing that money and that seed capital to the table, and then working with projects that are primarily connected based, so based in connectivity, that are addressing a specific social problem, and then bringing, as well as that, the technology teams that we have and the individuals in the company to bring that to the table as well. And that's the way we work.
You talk about looking for those projects and those specific social concerns. How do you identify the organizations and the projects that you work with? Because partnerships are so key to the whole way that the technology market now works.
I agree. I mean, some come from within the company, some may be in the room, some future ones may be in the room. We have specific programs we work on, primarily on health, on digital learning, on digital skills. I mean, take, for example, the 2010, the Haiti earthquake. Out of that came the world's fastest deployable 3G network, the Instant Network. If you look at it on the web, you'll find out about it and how we've deployed it. That came out of one guy in the media team who looked at the problems that Digicel were having in Haiti, and as a result of that said, what we really need is a network in a suitcase. If you take the company launched this year, you may have seen in the press a policy on domestic violence. So Vodafone was the first global company to say that any employee within the company in any country in which we operate is allowed up to 10 days paid leave if they're in an abusive relationship, to resolve that relationship and to seek help. That really came on the back of 9 years of work that we've done. If you look up, again, you'll see it in the App Store, an app called Bright Sky, which is a self-assessment tool if anyone's in an abusive relationship, or there's a handset called Texos, you'll see, which 100,000 women across Europe have used. Both of those projects, the first one came out of a relationship with an NGO called Hestia, and the second one came out of our work in Vodafone Spain. So the innovation comes from all sorts of places. What we find is that the investment of capital and the investment of the technology and the technologists and the people is critical to doing what we want to do, which is innovation at scale in a sustainable way.
Now, Tessa, working with organizations and growing your businesses, I suppose it's important that people understand what your business do. And about a year ago, you came and spoke to us on the podcast, and I remember you getting very frustrated that people thought that you were a charity. Is that still the case? So people still make that mistake?
Yes, it sort of drives us crazy, because we will explain to people what OLIO is and what we do, and they think that's wonderful. And then we explain to them that we are a for-profit organization, and suddenly sort of you can see their brains scrambling. They cannot compute something that is having a positive effect in the world, but also being for-profit. We are such strong believers that we've got to move away from that dichotomy. The only way forward for humanity is profit with purpose. That will be the new paradigm of the future. And there are a growing number of entrepreneurs who understand that, a small but growing number of investors. But we've really got to move away from sort of you can only do good if you're a charity. It's not helpful for anyone.
So I will ask this of you first, but I imagine the panel might want to jump in once you've had your say. Is tech for good actually a helpful phrase?
So I think tech for good is a helpful phrase right now, because people scratch their heads at us when we talk and when we explain what we do, and it's very helpful having an identity and a banner, and also, I guess, a sort of a cohort of peers. I would like to think that in 5 or 10 years' time, we no longer need that term, because, of course, tech should be for good. But right now, I don't think, sadly, it's obvious that that is the case. So it's a useful term right now.
Jeni, I can see you writing down some notes there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've learnt otherwise it goes out my head. I think for me it's a powerful phrase because it's not just not doing evil, right? It's not just avoiding bad, it's doing something positively good. And that implies something that is more proactive than just mitigating risk, if you like.
There seems to be a growing groundswell as well, though, of responsible leadership. You differentiate the two, right? Responsible leadership is something quite different from tech for good. Tech for good, as you were saying, is a bit more of a banner, right?
I think tech for good is an identity. It's like, are you a tech for good founder? Are you trying to solve these problems? Responsible tech is a way of doing things. It's, you should be acting responsibly when you're trying to achieve your aims. And they're two slightly different conceptual things. So I think both are useful, but I think the sort of tech for good movement does seem to be really on the march at the moment, in terms of there's more and more people identifying as founders, more and more people identifying as investors in that world, and that's super positive, I think.
Have we got any questions at this point before we move on? I can see hands this time. Yes, down here. Don't know where the mic is.
Thanks. Keep on going.
Second one, yeah.
Let me guess, WPP.
Yes. Hi, my name's Amy. Thank you to the panel. So we're talking about will tech save the world, and I'm just curious as to what are we trying to save the world from, and what kind of opportunity in particular do you think technology has to kind of like mitigate these risks and really bring something good to the world?
Is there anyone you'd particularly like to aim that at first, or?
Can I throw it to Andrew, actually?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends where you are in the world. What are you saving it from? I mean, if I can just answer the former question, then I'll answer this question. I'm not going to avoid the question, but I think on the, I think tech for good. I think slogans, hashtags. I think people are smart. You know what I mean? So I think they judge our programs on whether they're actually making a difference, whether they're delivering public benefit, not what we call them. You know what I mean? Also, I'm really interested. I think there is a space for charities in the future, but I think there is a rebalancing act that needs to be done, because I think if you're going to go for innovation at scale in a sustainable way, there has to be money in the system somehow that actually allows it to go that way. But there's lots of work that we do with organizations where it's very difficult to see where the business model will come from that will actually drive change and sustain change in that area. On what are you saving the world from? I think for us in our area, I suppose, a couple of big things. Eric Schmidt said recently, 2 or 3 years ago, people have no access to the written word. When they get connected, they have access to anything that's ever been written. It's a revolution that's happening in our lifetime. It absolutely is. My kids have no concept of how you could do homework without the internet. I'm old enough to remember doing that. And so when you go to some of the markets in which we operate in sub-Saharan Africa, and you meet people who have access to technology, it gives them access to connectivity, it gives them access to education, it gives them access to finance through products like M-Pesa, and it really is transformational in terms of their world. So you are saving them, in effect, from poverty. You are saving them from a lack of opportunity. And I see this many times with regard particularly to women, you are redressing a balance of power. Just give you one example. I was in Egypt recently, and we do a big digital literacy program, particularly focused on women in Egypt, 500,000 have learned to read and write through that program. And I asked one lady, why did she want to learn to read and write? She said she wanted to read the Quran. She then said she wanted to teach her children to read and write so she didn't have the disability, they didn't have the disability she had. And then she stopped. And she paused, and I knew she was checking me out, so I just sat and waited for what she wanted to say. And then she said this, she said, I also wanted to learn to read and write because I don't have a mobile phone, but my husband has a mobile phone, and I want to read the text on his mobile phone. Okay? And so it's not just about numeracy, it's not just about, learning languages, it's about empowerment as well of that woman and many like her. So I think it's a great question, depends where you are in the world, but certainly for us, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, the opportunity that comes through education is key, and that comes through connectivity.
Picking up on it depends on where you are in the world. When I was at a Web Summit in Lisbon, a Brazilian company who used tech to run love hotels approached me and said, can we have a chat to you? And I kind of immediately thought, do I really want love hotels on the podcast? Sounds a bit seedy. And they said, yeah, but hang on, take yourself out of your mindset in the UK, and you have a situation where people are living in favelas under, 8 people under one roof, and if you're a young courting couple, you literally have nowhere to go and have a private conversation with the person you're trying to build a relationship with. And actually, that's how people use those facilities in Brazil. And it kind of made me get out of that narrow-minded bubble of the UK. Just listening to Andrew talk there, Jeni, ODI, you're a global organisation. You must see some surprising and different cultural uses of technology that are quite uplifting.
Yeah, and we spoke about open banking earlier. One of the things that's interesting is taking some of the initiatives that start off here and some of the ways of working that start off here, and you translate them into another context, and you have to think very differently about actually what is the purpose in these cases. So with open banking, here we were very involved in the startup of the initiative. And the real emphasis was about improving competition in the banking sector. In fact, how it's worked out, then it's a bit more about the kinds of extra products and services that you might have on top of it. But it was a competition play here. You go into another context. So we worked in Mexico, advising them about their open banking initiative. And the top thing on their minds was about financial inclusion and how to include the unbanked in the banking sector, how to bring them into the banking sector. And I think that taught me both that there's a power in doing that, but also not to be too arrogant about it, because those kinds of initiatives can't translate one for one from one context to another.
Coming on to how we finance tech for good and tech. Paul, I'll come to you second. I'll actually start with Tessa, and I think you might have a counterpoint which might be interesting. Obviously, you're building a business which is profit with purpose. From your perspective, do you think that there's enough capital being given to companies where profit with purpose is kind of their core mission? And is a risk-averse approach in funding limiting the ability to scale and make a difference in society?
So I'm a startup founder. There is never enough capital. Goes without saying, but a slightly less sort of facetious answer. We have raised 3 rounds of equity financing in this space. And through that experience, we have learned that there's an enormous gap in the market. So there is the conventional VC market, which actually has an enormous amount of capital, but sadly it's not at all mission aligned with what we want to achieve. Excitingly, there is a nascent but rapidly growing sort of impact investing market. But the challenge that we've encountered there is that the amounts of capital that are available to be deployed are actually very small. So they might be a fund of 30 million or 50 million. And what that does is it makes those investors very risk averse because they have small amounts of capital to deploy. Their funds are early in the cycle, so they want to make sure bets. Plus, they're trying to convince all of their ex-banking colleagues that they haven't sort of lost their sanity by investing in this area. And so they're really trying to prove the business model. And so startups like us, which are tech for good, but have the ambition, so we want 1 billion people using OLIO in 10 years' time. So we're sort of marrying that purpose with the Silicon Valley scale. There's a real gap in the marketplace, and we don't see enough capital there yet. But what's also exciting is at the beginning we have the impact funds emerging. We do also at the top end have the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth taking place right now, and that new generation are wanting to invest in a way that is aligned with their values. So there's a real kind of gap in the middle, because these guys are wanting to write really big checks, And there's quite a bit at the beginning, and there's a gap in the middle right now.
Why is there that gap in the middle, Paul? What's the answer?
Well, we're in that gap at the moment, so, and growing very quickly. I think the pressure actually for that area to grow is really strong, partly because there's huge demand from people like Tessa. There's loads more founders who want that kind of capital now. Plus the investors, or the asset owners, if you like, whether that's families or pension funds, are getting interested in impact. Right up to the hugest of, so BlackRock, Larry Fink, who's the CEO, they own, I think, 4% of all shares globally. And as he said, in a few years' time, we won't be shareholders in companies that can't tell us how they benefit society. We won't invest in those companies. That's a huge shift. And over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see so much more impact investment in the world. And I think that's a great, great thing. But at the moment, it's still small and growing. But it has, even just the impact investing sector has doubled in size every year for the last 3 years. And we're now up to 500 billion. It's going to keep on going. So I think it's a very, very quickly growing market.
Just out of interest, where do you see your investment going? Obviously, Bethnal Green Ventures, I'd imagine the majority of your organisations that you're working with are London-based, but maybe that's wrong.
They're the largest group, but we back companies from all across Europe. So we're absolutely trying to be a European scale VC firm, but just focusing on tech for good.
What do you think that we can learn in the UK then from European, maybe your competitors in Europe or maybe in the US and how they're approaching?
Actually, I think the UK is the best place in the world to do this at the moment. Most other sort of countries would say that they think the UK is leading in impact investing. In the US, you have this huge dichotomy between philanthropy and for-profit, which means that impact investing is tricky. In Europe, you just don't have quite so much of the sort of the investment scene. And London's particularly good for this because we've got everything on top of each other. We've got the finance sector on top of the social sector, on top of the tech sector. It's all literally in the same city, whereas there's very few other places in the world that can claim that. So actually London is, I think, leading in this in the world.
Any other views on funding?
I think when you're working in philanthropy or a charity, then the number one measure is public benefit. You can't get away from that. You invest in projects that are for-profit based, regardless of how purposeful they are, but you've got to be very careful when you're in that, because actually the Charity Commission is about public benefit, and then we'll measure the success of a charity fund against public benefit. And we've done it a couple of times. We formed Just Text Giving with Just Giving, and 50 million went through that platform, and we're shutting it down now because people are giving in other ways. But that was a great innovation, and the first time people could give free on a text giving platform. I think, I agree with Tessa and the comment around, I think it's very restrictive, and I think it's restricted in the public space too, in terms of the public sector, in terms of the DFIDs, the USAIDs, and others, where you've got vast amounts of public money being put in, but to what extent are they going into projects that are long-term sustainable, because there is a for-profit agenda in there, and we find. Certainly we've raised over 118 million from those sources in the last 4 years into projects we're working on. But there is an anxiety on those who are investing on behalf of this taxpayer, in the same way there is an anxiety on those who are behaving on behalf of a charity, that there are restrictions about how you can invest. But if this growth sector is really booming, then I think we need to look at both how charities invest large amounts of individual charitable cash, particularly in America, and then also about how willing governments are to invest in for-profit ventures, which ultimately might address one or two of the issues that, back to the question around saving the world.
Jeni, you're nodding along vigorously. Anything to add, or just kind of agreeing?
I was kind of agreeing. We take part in a lot of these kinds of bids, and they'll always ask for some kind of sustainability plan, right? Is that what's going to happen at the end of one of these fantastic grants to make sure that this activity continues, and you write something or other. But actually, what is what would make it sustainable needs to be the building of a business model that means that some kind of which entails creating some kind of profit to make that come back. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Of course. Probably better than mine.
I was wondering, how do you provide guarantees for the future that the purpose that you have as an organisation, or the ones that you fund, is then locked in for the long run and isn't going to get diverted over time?
So we addressed this in our raise last summer, our Series A, and we inserted into our Articles of Association the wording from the B Corp movement, which, if you haven't heard of it, please do look up the B Corp movement. But essentially that cements into the organisation our mission, but then also the fact that we will give equal priority to people, profit and planet, rather than, obviously, previously our Articles of Association, our responsibility was to maximise shareholder return.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best way of guaranteeing it is to have a business model that's linked to your social and environmental impact.
Yeah.
So the more of the product or service you sell, the more positive impact you have in the world. If you can do that, then even if that company gets bought, still going to be positive, social in the world. But I absolutely agree. I think B Corps is super interesting, and it's growing really, really quickly at the moment, because it helps founders to lock in their vision of what their company will do in the future as well, which is great.
Yeah. I was in part wondering, so one of the kinds of things that we've seen, there's an organisation, Open Corporates, you probably know of, who have set up a specific data trust to hold the data that they otherwise collect, to guarantee in the future that even if they change hands, even if something else happens, that data at least will remain open and available for other people to use. And I think it's interesting when you think of building trust in the investors and in the customers that you have, how you put those kinds of locks into place that make sure that it's not just nice willingness right now, but it's something that's going to be guaranteed in the future.
Sticking with finance, but shifting gears slightly, Tessa, you and your co-founder are two women, but unfortunately you hear the stories, and they're not stories, as you rightly pointed out before we came on stage, Tessa, but stories, for want of a better phrase, of female co-founders actively seeking male co-founders because the investment community isn't prepared to invest in a sole female founder or female founding team. Why is that, Paul? Why is the investment community?
Right.
And look, I know you're the good guys.
Well,
but
how long have we got? Paul said no, he's one of the good guys.
Yeah.
So, the facts speak for themselves. Last year, 1% of venture capital investment went to female-founded businesses. Why I think that's really relevant to this panel is because I have noticed I've transitioned from a corporate world, which was predominantly male and white, into the saving the world space. I'm stunned and excited by the diversity that is happening here, because we are tackling the problems that affect the 99% of people. And so the entrepreneurs who are solving those problems are reflective of the 99% of people. Where we're coming a little bit unstuck is we have a wonderfully diverse set of founders solving real problems that really need to be solved, but they're butting up against the conventional VC industry, which a report was released, I think, earlier on this week, saying that only 13% of sort of check writing partners at VC firms are female. And when you have a product like we do, for example, that is addressing a problem that a female audience really understands, it can be very difficult pitching that to the current VC community, which isn't that diverse.
But then why are there not more male allies in the investment community, in the VC funds?
Why aren't there more what, sorry?
Why are there not more male allies writing those checks? Why is it that...
Oh, gosh, I mean... wow. It's tricky territory to go into. There are a number of amazing male allies, and we have many of them who have invested in OLIO, but the reality remains, when I pitch to a female investor, my conversion rate is 70 or 75%. When I pitch to a male investor, it's 5 or 10%. There's a handful of women in London who can write a check. So that means that these sort of diverse entrepreneurs who are solving real problems are finding it harder to get financed.
Hey, Paul, just from your perspective as someone who actually works in that.
Yeah, so I think our equivalent stat for the 1p in the pound that's invested in all female teams is 44p in the pound, and then 21p into mixed teams as well. So I think we're doing all right compared to the VC industry, which is awful. But again, I think there is something different about Tech for Good. It's attracting a much more diverse group of founders. we've backed ex-nurses, ex-social workers, ex-doctors, really people who really understand particular social problems, and that means that they're from a much more diverse set of backgrounds. And I think, again, in the future, hopefully these problems will go away, but I think the investors who don't change will also go away.
We've got less than 5 minutes left, and I want the panel to be able to wrap up their thoughts before we finish. Have we got any questions at the minute from the audience? I'd hope we would. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ayelet Elstein. My question is to the panel. I like what Tessa just said here in terms of there are not enough women at the moment that can write checks. And we've all been aware of a lot of efforts to increase awareness of investors, to invest in female-only companies, etc. And let's face it, it's not really working. So perhaps we need to solve that problem. And I come from an industry of luxury brands and art where it's male money buying male artists at big, fantastic sums. How about people like yourselves and people here in the audience actually work to solve that problem and to actually enhance confidence in women to own that capital and then to actually invest it, even if it's in remits they're not 100% aware of or completely feel comfortable with. And just like men, they go and do research, we need to actually equip women to feel confident to do that. And perhaps this would be a way to solve the root cause of why there's not enough money invested in women's startups. So this is just a general question. I don't know who wants to answer that.
Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. I mean, definitely come and see us at BGV. I think, we have an 80% female team at BGV. I'm definitely the exception. I don't know why I'm up here actually thinking about it, but I think hopefully it will change. The other thing I'd note is actually, so we have a fund that's for individual investors, and most of those kind of funds most of the investors in them are men. But actually, again, our Tech for Good fund is, I think 45% of the investors in it are female. So I think, again, actually the sort of mission-led business side of things seems to be changing things. It seems to be more appealing to a more diverse kind of group than the old world of just straight VC, whatever you want to call it. So I think things are changing, but we need to come in behind all these kind of projects to really give them some superpowers.
Any further thoughts on that, or no? Any more questions? Yes, sorry, there's a question here. Very enthusiastic.
Hello, my name is Michael. I recently discovered a new term. It's called the deep adaptation. It basically says that the runaway climate change is inevitable. Vicious circles, feedback loops, tipping points, and it is a giant threat to the society. And I was just wondering, how do we cope with the fundamental problems that are affecting the whole planet? And I'm just wondering, have you ever heard of this term, deep adaptation?
I read an email just this morning, probably the same one that you read, talking about exactly that. And I was a little bit depressed by the first half of the email. And I was going to answer your question earlier on about how can tech save the world. We have to acknowledge that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. It's not climate change, it's a climate crisis. And we will only solve this problem if we arm up as if it's a war, which means that each and every one of us has to get involved solving that problem, either through what our businesses are doing or through how we're acting in our personal lives and how we sort of consume and behave. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the sort of adaptation approach right now, because I really feel that we haven't even started meaningfully addressing the climate crisis, and I would much rather we meaningfully address it to the best of our abilities immediately before relinquishing and sort of talking about adaptation, because what we're talking about, if we don't mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis, are things like the collapse of civilization, 1 billion climate migrants. These are things that personally I'm not happy to entertain, and I'm sure everybody in the audience feels the same way.
Look, we are pretty much out of time. I think that's a nice wrap-up with the kind of the idea of how will tech save the world. Are you guys around to answer any more questions? Do you have to shoot off? Great. So if anyone has any more questions, please do grab our panel at the side of the stage. But other than that, please thank them for their time.
Introduce the panel talking about how to scale your disruptive startup. Here is Paul Armstrong, who's a founder, an author, a Forbes contributor, and many other things, I'm sure. Over to you, Paul.
Are we on? We're on. OK, last session, guys. So you can sit down right now.